Hey everyone, and welcome back for another episode of Might I Add, Hitting the Field's own spin-off show. I'm Partain, and we've got something a little bit different for everyone today. And this week, it's going to be recapping the best week in sports in November. No, it's not rivalry week. We're talking college basketball's very own feast week. And we've got a lot in store for you all today, from UCF's performance in the Wooden Legacy all the way to number one Duke, losing at home to an unranked opponent. That, plus all the intel on the week's biggest tournaments. And helping me today to help us sort all this out is our very own Chris Tran. Chris, how you doing, man?
Pretty good, man. Thanks for having me on the show. First time. I'm excited to be on, might I add.
And it's going to be a really great show today. So we're going to start things off a little locally, as we normally do, UCF sports. And it's going to be UCF basketball. The men's basketball team traveled to Anaheim, California this week to play in the Wooden Legacy tournament. And things got off to a little bit of a shaky start for them. The team suffered a 67-68 loss to Penn in the opening night of the tournament. The Knights shot just 32% from the floor in that game. So, Chris, I'm curious, what was the problem for UCF in that matchup?
Well, I think you just said it, and it was really just scoring the basketball. I mean, anytime you get held to under 32% shooting, it's not going to be a good day. I mean, UCF is known for their defense, but your defense can only take you so far if you're only going to shoot, like you said, 32% from the field. And I think that's where they got off to a bad start.
And the way they lost it also sucks. Darren Green shooting a 2, not a 3. Not ideal, but, J.R. Smith isn't the only one anymore now. Anyways, after the rough start, UCF did get things turned around. They scored back-to-back victories over Pepperdine and Charleston to finish the tournament in 5th place overall. More importantly, they outscored both of those two teams by an average of 17 points, and they looked as good offensively as they have all season. So how was UCF able to turn things around and actually get some offensive momentum?
Yeah, so I think in those next two games, you saw a better shooting performance, and I think that was big. These teams aren't tournament teams, as you would say, but you still had to take care of business in the tournament, and I think that's what you saw this weekend. They were scoring better. Their defense, once again, played to their potential, and they were able to take care of business. The only thing that stinks is if they would have won against Penn, you would have got to see them against Arizona. That would have been a great matchup to see, just to see how UCF measures against those top-tier opponents. But the schedule that they played in the tournament, I think they took care of business after that drop to Penn.
And it is kind of disappointing that UCF didn't get to play Arizona because they don't truly have that kind of opportunity this season to play against a top-level opponent again. Memphis is probably the best they're going to get. But anyways, UCF is now with a record of 5-2. And they've got a relatively smooth schedule the rest of the way until conference play begins, kind of like we hinted at. Their toughest remaining non-conference game is going to be at Oklahoma. So, Chris, where do you see UCF sitting once conference play starts?
So I feel like you said, they should take care of business in the out-of-conference schedule at this point. There isn't really too much of a challenge. I think the Oklahoma game going to Oklahoma will be a pretty big test, although I do think this is a down year for Oklahoma. They're still not a team to be slept on. You still have to go and take care of business there. But going to the tournament, I think you should be probably about where you expected to be coming into the season. With a whole new roster, a whole new team, you got to figure out your identity. Going into this conference play, they're going to be about where you think they should be sitting.
Yeah, ideally, UCF like to have under 5 losses by the time non-conference play wraps up, and I think that's very realistic at this point in the season. But let's go a little bit bigger. So elsewhere in the Wooden Invitational, Arizona got 3 straight victories over Pepperdine, Penn, and Wake Forest to win the tournament. The Wildcats appear to be the top contender in the Pac-12 right now at this point in the season. And Chris, I'm curious to say, what kind of impressed you with Arizona in this one?
Yeah, I feel like Arizona came in slept on. Like you said, Oregon came into the season as the Pac-12 favorite, and Arizona has just looked really strong so far early in the season. They took care of business in the tournament, like you said. Not overly powerful teams you saw across the Maui Gym and just other tournaments throughout Feast Week. There were better opponents to be played, but they took care of business in this tournament, and they've just looked really strong so far this season.
And that's really all you can ask for these teams is you play your schedule, beat who you beat, and they've beaten who they've beaten. They're currently undefeated. And in their championship game against Wake Forest, the Arizona guard play put up 20 points to lead the Wildcats to a victory. So how important is it for Arizona to get consistent play out of their guard Smith this season?
Yeah, and I think that's where their offense is going to have to go through. If their guards can put up points, like you said, 20 points to 25 points a game, that's huge for them. They're going to pound the paint. But if you can get points from your guards, your shooting, outside shooting, it's going to help them spread the floor, and they're going to be able to do a lot better, a lot more movement offensively. They're going to have a lot more space, and I think that's what's going to drive them towards a pretty successful season.
And Dylan Smith has been fantastic so far for the Wildcats this season, really the catalyst for that offense. And let's kind of switch gears here. Perhaps the biggest tournament of the week was the Battle for Atlantis in the Bahamas. It was a loaded field, including 4 top 15 teams with North Carolina, Gonzaga, Oregon, and Seton Hall. And then, of course, there's Michigan. The national media has been kind of sleeping on Michigan this past few weeks, but if you follow this team at all prior to this tournament, you knew that this team had some firepower, and they put that firepower to work this week. The Wolverines ended up winning the Battle for Atlantis by defeating Iowa State, North Carolina, and Gonzaga in just as many days. So, Chris, what do you think about Michigan? How are they able to get through this gauntlet?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I feel like if you paid attention to this team, you knew, like you said, they had firepower going into this tournament. But now it came a time where the opponents started to show up on their schedule, and they had to put it all together and see how real is this Michigan team. And I think you saw this week, they can beat anyone in the country. I mean, to have them not ranked going into this weekend, I don't really understand how they weren't a ranked team. And I'm curious to see where they sit when this AP poll comes out. But you can see they can beat any team in the country. And I think it leads with their senior guard, Xavier Simpson, averaging, I believe, 13 points, 10 assists a game. It's going to run through him. He's going to control the floor. And then you're just going to have their center down low. He's been a beast all season, too. And I feel like it's just a really complete team with a new coach that's buying into his system.
And the system's working right now for Michigan. Elite offense, solid defense. The team looks really good. And I am kind of curious what the highest jump ever into the polls has been for college basketball, because Michigan has a chance to be the highest ever.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm curious to see where they're at, because how high will they put them, because they were unranked. But they're playing out of their minds right now, and I don't expect that to slow down, really.
Yeah, it probably won't, and we're about to see if that's the case, because moving forward, Michigan gets another huge matchup when they play at Louisville on Tuesday, who will likely be the number 1 team in the country at that point. So, Chris, what do you like going into that matchup?
Well, so as good as Michigan has looked, I mean, I think it's unrealistic to just say that they just keep knocking off top 10 opponents, right? I mean, there has to be a game where they just get beat, and I think it might be at Louisville. They went to a tournament and they took care of business, but now coming out of that tournament, going against the number 1 team in the country, Louisville just looked really strong all across the board all season. And I think they'll drop the game, but I don't think that's any indication of Michigan slowing down. Louisville's just that good.
I agree, and it's tough to win these true road games. That you win the those tournament games, they're neutral site.
Exactly.
So you do have a fan base there, a fan base present, and now playing at the KFC Yum Center is a very traditionally difficult place to play.
It's a huge place for basketball. Louisville is always going up for these games, and I just think that when you're in a tournament and you're in the right mindset, you can run through a tournament pretty, not easily, but like if you just get off to a hot start, you can run through a tournament. You're in the same location, you get into a rhythm, and you can just go through a tournament. But then, like you said, you go on the road, it's just a whole totally different beast. And Louisville is playing the best basketball in the nation right now.
So Louisville going to be a tough one for Michigan. However, elsewhere in the tournament, Gonzaga fought through several key injuries throughout the tournament, but they were still able to reach a championship game after a tough win over Oregon in the semifinals. So I'm curious what exactly the future of this Bulldogs team looks like.
So I think they're fine. I mean, they have a tough out-of-conference schedule. Like you said, they've already played some tough opponents, and they still have a couple more to go. I believe Arizona, Washington are on their schedule, and I believe UNC as well. That's going to be tough, but when they go into conference play, they're going to take care of that conference pretty easily, and I still think they can go into the NCAA tournament in a top 3 seed. They get on a roll once conference play starts happening, and then they're a well-coached team. They always are. They're going to be fine once March comes around. It's just been a little bit of a tough stretch going on early with some injuries on the roster.
Yeah, Gonzaga. It's Gonzaga. Mark Few's got it going up there.
Exactly.
It's going to be fine, and they're probably going to roll through the West Coast Conference again. And there's just too much that happened in this tournament to really get into all the details about everything. So I'm just going to ask you real quick, what other quick takeaway you have from that tournament?
Well, so I mean, a team that we didn't mention is UNC, and I think they have the most exciting freshman in the nation in Cole Anthony, and he can score the basketball with anybody. And I think it just proved, although they did have a loss in the tournament, I still think he's the best freshman far and away. And they're just going to be a really exciting team to watch going forward.
And I agree, North Carolina could really contend this season. And that takes us to another major tournament of this past week in Feast Week, and that was the Maui Jim Invitational. The storyline going into this tournament was that it could potentially be a Final Four preview in the finals between Michigan State and Kansas. But that was never an option, because in the opening day of the tournament, Virginia Tech walked in, knocked off Sparty with a 71-66 victory. And Chris, in the long run, what does this kind of thing mean for Michigan State?
Well, I don't think it means all too much. I do think coming into the season being ranked as the preseason number 1 was a little high of a ranking. I don't think they're going to be that high, but whenever Tom Izzo's coaching, that team's going to be fine. I mean, they're going to be able to do really well in the Big Ten. As far as win the Big Ten Conference, probably they could, they might not, but they're going to be at the top. Like, they're going to be fine. This loss doesn't really mean too much for them going forward. I just think they were a little bit too highly ranked going into the season.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, to your point, when Coach Izzo's coaching, they're still going to be a top 15 throughout the entire season, top 15 team. They're probably going to be a top 3 seed in the conference tournament, top 3 seed in the NCAA. Michigan State's fine. And let's talk a little bit about the other side of the bracket. Kansas defeated host team Chaminade, BYU, and then Dayton in the finals to win the Invitational. Kansas dominated in the paint in this tournament, largely due to Udoka Azubuike, who scored 29 points in the win over Dayton in the finals. So what has impressed you the most with this Kansas team?
Well, so I just think Kansas is just going to continue to just play bully ball and just grind their way through the tournament. I mean, when Azubuike's playing like that, there's nobody in the nation that's going to be able to stop him, like, at all. It wouldn't, like, I think they're probably my most confident pick to make the Final Four because I think they don't rely on their outside shooting as much as other teams, and they can just pound the paint inside and play bully ball all their way straight through the tournament.
And yeah, Kansas, it looks like they're going to roll through the Big 12, get that top. Yeah. They may even be the top overall at this point just because the schedule lines up favorably for them. But anyways, we'd be completely wrong if we didn't talk about Dayton with this tournament. The Flyers had convincing wins over Georgia and Virginia Tech before losing in overtime to Kansas. And after seeing how this team competed in the Maui Gym tournament, where does Dayton stack up in the A10?
Yeah, so the A10 I feel like is a little bit down this year. VCU is always going to be there just because they're a really well-run organization, but I still think Dayton is the best team in the A10. They can score with anybody, and I just feel like Dayton, once March comes around, they're always a dangerous team. Like, they can always pull off an upset here or there, and it wouldn't surprise me if it happened again this season. They just might be higher ranked where it might not even be an upset in the first round of the NCAA tournament. They can score with anybody, and I think they're just really off to a hot start. That overtime loss to Kansas proves a lot because Kansas is tough to beat.
Yeah, and Dayton looks really good. They're sitting pretty in a league that's good, not great. VCU down, and St. Louis having a pretty solid start to the season. So Dayton sitting pretty in this early stretch of the season. And let's go ahead and talk about something a little bit different. Now, a lot of the top 10 teams lost this past week. Michigan State, North Carolina, Gonzaga, all of them suffering losses. However, the biggest upset of the tournament wasn't actually in any of these early season tournaments, but rather Cameron Indoor Stadium in Durham, North Carolina. Duke had looked like one of the more complete teams in college basketball before they ran into the gauntlet that is called Stephen F. Austin. Duke was outplayed in the game, missing 16 free throws, committing 22 turnovers. The result, an 85-83 loss at home. Chris, did Duke just kind of overlook Stephen F. Austin, or is this a bigger issue for them?
Yeah, so I think they just really overlooked them, and I don't think they can do that this year simply because the talent level isn't as high at Duke as it has been in probably the past 5 to 10 years, honestly. This is going to be – Coach K has to coach more this year than he has in a long time. I don't think that's a bad thing because he takes pride in his coaching. But the talent level isn't high enough where they can just take teams for granted and just roll in and think they're just going to beat anybody because the individual talent isn't there. I just think this is a game where they just came in, Thanksgiving weekend, they're at home. They just roll in there, think they're going to take care of business, and they just didn't. You still have to show up every single game, and I think that's honestly just what they proved this against Stephen F. Austin.
Yeah, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that talent factor because in the game against the Lumberjacks, Duke's bench had just 7 points, and Javon DeLaurier has averaged just 3.5, just under 4 points per game, which really isn't an improvement from last season for the Blue Devils. So where are DeLaurier's struggles coming from, and just the bench in total?
Yeah, and I mean, it's weird because if you look from last season to this season, last season DeLaurier was more of a role player. You weren't expecting as much from him because, you had Zion, you had RJ Barrett, you had Cam Reddish to carry the load. This season, DeLaurier is a veteran player on that team. You expected him to step up and contribute greatly to this team, and it just hasn't happened yet. He hasn't been scoring the basketball, and he hasn't really improved in in any of the last 3 years. I don't really know what the problem is. I feel like we both expected him to do better and kind of come into his own this year, but it just hasn't really happened yet.
And kind of looking forward for Duke real quick, I want to know, are they capable of winning the ACC?
I believe they're capable. I wouldn't say they're the favorites by any means, but I think they're capable. They're still a really well-coached team, and they still have talent on the roster. But teams like UNC and Virginia and Louisville, there's just so many good teams, it's hard to say that they will win it, but they can.
Yeah, the ACC is really stacked this season, so it's going to be really difficult for Duke to be able to pull it off. But Chris, I got a new thing here we want to talk about. Haven't done it yet, but let's talk winners and losers from this year's Feast Week. And let's start with our winners. So, Chris, who you got as your winner?
So my winner, I mean, we mentioned them earlier. It's hard not to, is Michigan. I just think Michigan has been on a roll this year. Whenever a coach like John Beilein leaves your program, he's been phenomenal for Michigan. And you get a first-year head coach in Juwan Howard, who was a player at Michigan. He knows the tradition there. It's still a new system that you have to buy into. And this team has done that, and they've looked like a top 10 team in the nation, which I wouldn't say it was I think everybody knew they were going to be better than what the experts said, but nobody expected them to be this good, knocking off top 10 quality opponents this early in the season. And I think that's just been my biggest win of the week, biggest win of the year, really, has been Michigan.
And yeah, I kind of like that pick. Michigan has certainly looked the part of a contender in this past week. And for my winner, I'm going to have to go with the Maryland Terps. Stay in the Big Ten. They're 8-0 now. They just participated in the Orlando Invitational, and they looked really, really solid, beating teams like Temple, Harvard, and then Marquette straight in a row to win that tournament. Also, you got to look at them as far as winners are concerned. A lot happened around them. They're very likely going to be number 2 when the new AP rankings come out. So it's hard not to look at this Maryland team and say that they were not a big winner from their own play and the play around them this past week. So that being said, let's kind of take a look at the losers from this week. And Chris, who you got?
So for me, it's Texas Tech. They were ranked 12 in the nation coming into this Thanksgiving weekend. And I think it was really just a big test. You look at the last 2 years, they made an Elite Eight appearance and they made an NCAA championship appearance. When you lose your best player in Jarrett Culver and then just really most of the team around you, you know you're not going to get that the recruiting that a Kansas gets or a Texas gets in the Big 12. So it really has come around coaching, and it was really, let's see how this team, if they can carry it forward where they left off last year. And they just had a couple of losses in this Thanksgiving tournament that I just think that it's going to drop them in the rankings, probably in the 20s, maybe even outside the top 25. I just don't think this is going to be the type of year Texas Tech wanted going forward.
And it is kind of a bummer because after they had such high expectations coming into this season after last year's awesome tournament run, it's certainly been kind of a setback for the Red Raiders.
Yeah, and it's hard to keep that up when you lose your best player in college basketball.
It really is, and that goes for any team.
Exactly.
Texas Tech just happens to be the one suffering from that, right, in this situation. However, for my loser, I'm going to have to go a little bit bigger and say the entire Big East Conference. They showed this week they could not win the games that mattered. Villanova lost to Baylor. Xavier lost to Florida. Marquette losing to Maryland. Georgetown, after they got that big win over Texas a couple weeks ago, they've lost 3 straight. And it's just Providence, you look at Providence, 5-4. These are classic, really historic Big East teams. And really, Butler's kind of carrying the torch right now for the Big East. They're 7-0. So down week for the Big East. They haven't been able to win those games that mattered, and it's going to be really important for them to get 1 or 2 of those teams to stack up a bunch of conference wins to get a high seed. Otherwise, it may just not happen. And well, folks, that's all the time we've got for today's episode of Might I Add. Chris, thanks for joining me, man. It's been a blast.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Love talking college basketball.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you to everyone at home who's watching this episode. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube page, and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Hitting the Field. I'm Kyle Partain. He's Chris Tran. And thanks for joining us this season for Might I Add. Happy holidays, everyone, and see you next season.